I'm going to talk about, first of all, uh, African economic growth data, and then specifically on the composition of growth data in terms of North African countries. And uh, as you all know, economic development uh, in African countries changes from region to region. Uh, when we look at Northern Africa growth rate since from 2004, uh, between 2004 and 2014, I mean, for 11 years, the average growth rate of total African countries are about 5.4%, much higher than the world growth data, even many other countries. And for Northern African countries, which have 6 countries in total, it is about 4.4%, 1% less than almost the average total African countries. But the problem is we have to consider for this period the clash of North African countries. Sometimes we call Arab Spring, sometimes uphold and Arab crash anyway. So excluding the last a couple of years, this growth rate of northern countries much higher than the total average African countries. Almost all the countries in the region are on the average of the region. Almost more or less 4 to 5% on average. Libya is, of course, outlier, which is very unstable in the region, especially last years. I'm going to talk about specifically that country. So the growth data of the region changes due to Arab uphold in recent years. When we look at, in general, on the trade balance of the region countries, they are almost zero as of percent of GDP. When we compare the trade balance as of GDP, I'm talking about. Trade balance means export data volume minus import data. So in Africa general, it is 3% positive balance. So trade balance of Algeria and Libya are positive, others are highly negative. The reason why Algeria and Libya is positive because they are oil producing and exporting countries, of course. But the fact is that, unfortunately, this is not anymore true for recent years because of the conflict, especially in Libya. It is not anymore true right now. When we come to Central Africa, again, for the last 11 years, between 2004 and 14, Central African countries grew 5.4%, almost the same as total African countries, average African countries. We have 8 countries in the region. Some countries are growing very fast. Fast-moving, I call them fast-movings, are Democratic Republic of Congo, Chad, but Chad's growth path is not stable because of the problems. You almost all know that in 2 years ago, almost, they had a big problems. All other countries are growing below the region. So which means that only the Congo is growing stably or sustainably. So which means that we have a big problem of stability and sustainability in the Central African countries. When we look at the trade balance, the trade balance of the region countries are very above the African average, which means that their trade surplus, please look at this number, their trade balance as of GDP is surplus is 20%. You never see in any other region in the world. Compared to the 3% surplus of Africa in African general, it is very high. But trade balance, again, some countries like Cameroon, Central African Republic, and Sao Tome and Principe are negative. But for the others, it is quite positive. You can consider this because the domestic demand is so low, purchasing power is low, and they have some mining resources. For Western African countries, for the last 11 years, average growth rate is very high and much higher than average African countries, 6.2%. We have 15 countries in this region. Countries growing above the region, I mean, fast movings we have. Among them, some like Ghana, Nigeria, Niger, the other must be Niger, is very high. But Burkina Faso, Niger, Sierra Leone is very, it is still, they are again fast moving, but not that high as Ghana and Nigeria, I'm sorry. But all the others are below than average African countries. Again, when we look at the trade balance of the region countries are very above the African average. Again, 5.4% of their trade surplus as of GDP. But trade balance of many of the region countries are again negative and unstable. How about Eastern African countries? For the last 11 years again, their growth rate was very much higher than total African countries, which is 6.8%. Very much, of course, higher than world growth data. Especially in Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Tanzania, the growth rate are much, much higher than average Eastern African countries. They are fast-moving countries. Almost all others are below the average of East African countries' growth rate. How about the trade balance of the region? When we look at the trade balance of the region countries, they are lower than African average. Their trade deficit is 10% of their total GDP. And trade deficits of all the region countries are again very high and unstable. How about South African countries? In this region we have 12 countries, and again the growth rate, average growth rate of the region countries are very high, 6.8%, and much higher than total African countries, again much higher than world growth rate for the same period. We have some fast-moving countries again, which means that their growth rate are very, very fast. One is Angola, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and also Botswana, Lesotho, and Namibia. They are growing higher than average the region. And all others are growing below the average. Again, when we look at the trade balance of the region countries, their trade balance are very above the African average. which means that they are giving or producing trade surplus, not deficit. Trade surplus. So 6% of the average trade surplus of the region countries are 6% of their total gross domestic product, compared to 3% of Africa general, which is very high again. But the trade balance of many of the region countries are again highly negative and unstable. So, the one conclusion from the general perspective of the regional growth performance of African countries are that in each region there are some countries, small number of countries, they grow very high. They are relatively, of course, comparatively stable in politics, comparatively stable in terms of economics, and they have less conflicts within the country as well as their neighboring countries, and they have more resources, so they have better connections to the rest of the world, outside Africa especially. So they create more value-added economy. That's why they grow faster than others. But the problem is that are they sustainable? Unfortunately, that is the big question. Because without political stability, because cultural stability, because of lack of if you lack of economic instability, you cannot sustain your growth performance. That's the problem. When we look at macroeconomic performance, of course, we have to look at growth data. This is the one data. We have to look at trade balance, export and import, as well as current deficit, including the services, invisible goods and services. So again, the trade balance is not sustainable. That's the problem. We have some countries in almost each region, those create more surpluses, which means that their exports value and volume of exports are much higher than their imports, which means that they sell to outside of their country much higher than they buy from outside their country. So they create money. But that's not sustainable for a long period of time for that individual country. But the rest of the region countries are not creating the same value-added economy. That is the problem. As I was talking to some of my colleagues during our visit to the ministry, sustainability and performance of economic growth for African countries should not be considered as individual. We cannot consider that an individual African country can be competitive, can be productive. No. There is a disease nowadays going on in a couple of countries in Western countries, right? Region. But for people like me who are planning to visit somewhere in eastern side or southern side of the continent, fears of going nowadays. So that affects all of us, for investors, for everybody. So trade balance is not sustainable. Only a couple of countries for each region can create surpluses. How about growth performance of the northern countries? Let's look at Morocco. For Morocco, Mr. Ambassador was talking about their economy. I was asking a question. The data with me is somehow different than what he says. Okay, the growth rate, the performance of Moroccan economy is better than many others. Not only for the rest of northern side, but for northern side of the African countries also. See, better than the average of North African countries. The blue ones shows us the growth performance of Moroccan economy. As far as trade balance, you see the blue ones are exports of goods, and the other one is imports of goods. Imports value is growing higher than export value, which means that the competitiveness of the country is not increasing. That is the problem. That was the question that I was raising to the Mr. Ambassador, that the economy is not going more productive, is not going more competitive. That is the problem. When we look at the demand composition, what are the compositions of demand, which is the source of growth? We see here that the economy is not creating sustainably gross capital formation. We have two kinds of formations. One is human capital, the other is physical capital formation. So the economy is not creating sustainably capital formation. And the exports and imports data also, again, the growth of import is higher than the growth of export for Morocco, which means that economy is not becoming more and more competitive, unfortunately, but it is much better than the rest of the other countries. For foreign direct investment, yes, as the Mr. Ambassador told us in the very early of today, the country is receiving foreign direct investment, but when we look at the data, it is not that much increasing. It was, in 2007, it was about 2.7 billion US dollar. Now, in 2012, it is almost same. It decreased during the global crisis. Yes, we understand. But it recovers. Yes, that's true. But how much it recovers? Almost the same level as in the past. Yes, debt ratio is much better than other countries. You know the Maastricht criteria for public finance. Public finance is 60% of total GDP. It is much less than 60%. That's correct. For Libya, it's terrible. It was good. It wasn't better. I mean, it was better. But since 2011, look at 2011. How can you talk about the performance or competitiveness of this country? Because of the problems, you follow. In 2011, economy decreased 53% almost. After a year, in 2012, economy grew more than 100%. And then decreased, then increased a little bit, and now, so it is not sustainable unless the political conflicts end. That's the problem. And trade balance, because Libya is oil producing and exporting country, but it decreases. It was one of the biggest trade surplus country, but now it looks like that the growth rate of export of the country decreases and the import increases. That's the problem. And the direct investment, no direct, unfortunately, they had about $5 billion for each year foreign direct investment, but not anymore, unfortunately. FDI outflows, that shows the outflows escaping from the country. The blue ones are coming into the country. So everybody is escaping from the country. Debt ratio is small but doesn't show us much, Kate. For Egypt is another interesting country, and since the end of Mubarak period, it was very conservative and stable. But since that time, it is the third government changed. So it is not stable, it is not satisfactory. The trade balance is, they create more and more deficit. See this issue, and then they are in recent years. Egypt is an interesting country. They have different characteristics. They are not producing more oil and gas, but they have tourism sector, some other infrastructures that they can create more productive economy. So that is the gross capital formation. Foreign direct investment. No foreign direct investment can come into the country while you have such a big political conflict within the country. This is the debt ratio. That's interesting. Yeah, I'm stopping. And then debt ratio is increasing. It was very lower, and for Algeria it is different. For Algeria there is not such a, they don't have such a conflict, political conflict. They had 25 years ago, but not anymore right now. And but their growth performance is very conservative, and but stable anyway. Their trade balance is much better than others. They are producing and selling to the rest of the world. But the problem is those countries, unfortunately, do not produce other than oil. That is the problem. They don't have a production capacity. That's the problem. And they sometimes in some countries and regions, when you look at the data, they have some skilled labor. There is a mismatching unemployment. They cannot find a better job. Those people go outside, Europeans, United States. Sometimes foreign direct investment come and build and initiates new factories. The problem is finding skilled labor. In that time, sometimes they have in different sides of mismatching unemployment problems. Okay.
If you don't have individual countries being measured the way you are, then how can a country determine its strength of its currency? So you were saying earlier it should be done in regions, but then unless you have a regional currency, I'm not sure how you can show the strength of a currency.
I'm not showing currency.
No, you're not. But I'm saying, how does a country demonstrate its own strength or weakness of its currency without all the measurement you've just showed us?
Yeah, that's correct. That they can't. They can't. That's why I did not touch upon that issue. One of the problems of the region countries, especially the northern side of these countries, are their currency problem. I had many notes on especially monetary and monetary policy, especially. But for some countries, we really can admire their policies following their central banks, their sometimes fiscal discipline, especially for Morocco, for example, Algeria. But the problem, they do not have political stability. Without political stability, they cannot create economic stability. They cannot sustain monetary and fiscal policy, exchange policy, and other policies. So the currency they follow, of course, cannot follow their competitiveness in that sense. I agree. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you again, Professor.